Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this Arvo for the Mite Resistance Management webinar. First, I just wanted to quickly whip around and introduce everybody. So my name's Emma Chorley. I'm the Regional Extension Officer with CottonInfo based in the Namoi Valley. Our guest speakers today, we've got Paul Grundy from the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and Paul is also the CottonInfo Technical Lead for Integrated Pest Management. And we've also got Lisa Bird from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. Lisa is based in Tamworth and is involved in the actual sampling and testing for resistance in mite populations. Also from CottonInfo, we've got Annabelle Twine, the Regional Extension Officer for the Darling Downs, and Annabelle liaises with Paul in the IPM space. And Megan Woodward. Megs is our comms lead for CottonInfo and is the guru behind the scenes for all things high tech. So we're very grateful she's on board today. So thank you to all those people for their time. The purpose of this afternoon's webinar is just to touch a little bit on where the current mite resistance is up to and to discuss the changes to the insecticide resistance management strategy for mite control in northern New South Wales. Thank you for joining us. So I guess firstly, I might hand over to Lisa for the resistance update.
Thanks, Emma, for that. And yeah, look, I really don't want to take up too much time today talking, about resistance testing results in any great detail, but I thought it was important just to give you a bit of a brief recap on the current situation with two-spotted mite resistance in northern New South Wales. Because, coming into this next season, it'll be useful for you to know what the resistance levels mean in terms of how they're likely, to affect product performance, particularly in light of the increasing levels of diphenthioron resistance that we saw last season in northern New South Wales, and what that's likely to mean in terms of possible impacts for other cotton miticides. So just starting off with a bit of a long-term overview of diphenthioron resistance in northern New South Wales. And this graph here just shows you the overall incidence of resistance in mites and how that's changed over the last few seasons. Now, each of those blue bars there just shows the level of resistance in those mite populations which tested positive for resistance to diphenthioron. And you can see that resistance started to emerge in around about 2020. And then it was, I guess at that time at pretty low levels up until the end of the 22-23 season. But you'll also remember that there was a major outbreak of cotton aphids during 2023. And because there was an increase in the use of diphenthioron to control those aphids, and also because it was being used to treat whitefly populations as well during the later part of that season, this was placing a lot of selection pressure on any mites that happened to be in those crops at the time when they were sprayed. And then, of course, those mite populations ended up establishing in weeds or in cereal crops over winter, and then, carried forward, and those populations were then able to re-establish in nearby cotton crops in the following spring. And this table here just gives you a bit more detail about the actual levels of resistance in individual fields in the Namoi and Gwydir last season. And those results in red there on the right-hand side of that table are the samples that tested positive for diphenthioron resistance, and you can see that the majority of samples that we tested last season did actually have resistant mites in them. In fact, many samples had over 20% resistance, and there were even some fields with over 50% resistance. But you'll also notice that there was quite a lot of variability in resistance between sampling locations, and that some fields did appear to be at higher risk of a selection event occurring compared with some other fields, just based on their pre-existing levels of resistance. Because, as you can imagine, if you've already got a measure of resistance in your mite population, and then you expose that population to another application of diphenthioron, then you're going to end up pushing that resistance level even higher. And Paul's going to touch a little bit and talk a bit more about how spray history is actually quite a high risk factor for driving up resistance in mites. This table here just summarises the results from last season, and you can see that dramatic increase in average diphenthioron resistance in northern New South Wales from 3% in 2022-23 to 22% last season, which is a pretty significant jump. And resistance was highest in the Gwydir at 32%, and it was about 11% in the Namoi. So all this means that it is quite likely that control will continue to be variable this season, and we'll continue to see mite surviving applications of diphenthioron, particularly in those high risk fields where we know, there are localised populations which have already got quite a high level of resistance in them. And unfortunately, this situation with diphenthioron resistance comes on top of pre-existing levels of ivermectin resistance, which we have seen in cotton for over 10 years now, and which is still sitting between 25 and 30% in the Namoi Gwydir. And because we already have limited rotational options for mites in cotton, we really don't want to risk diphenthioron ending up like ivermectin and potentially putting even more selection pressure on other mite products. So to try and ease selection pressure on diphenthioron, the IRMS now states that diphenthioron should not be reapplied to the same crop in the same season. And again, Paul's going to talk a bit more about this as part of the revised IRMS for this season. I guess just one other thing to keep in mind is that we have seen some evidence in the lab of multi-resistance in mites. So in other words, mites with diphenthioron resistance could also have independent genes for ivermectin resistance. So if you're rotating those two products, you might still see some survivors coming through one or other of those sprays. So, I guess, obviously this isn't great news in the sense that, the small number of effective products that we have for mites in cotton just got even smaller. So resistance management is going to be a bit of a challenge, and Paul's got some suggested use patterns for mite products for you to consider as part of the discussion session a bit later on. But, on the positive side, there are still very low levels of resistance to other mite products, so things like propagite and etoxazole. And the other good thing is that there's no evidence of cross-resistance between diphenthioron and either propagite or etoxazole, which means that those products should still be effective rotational options because they should still control mites that are carrying either diphenthioron or ivermectin resistance. But because propagite is not something that's readily available, I guess the next challenge is going to be, that increased risk around the use of etoxazole because, really it's the only remaining product with good selectivity and good efficacy on two-spotted mites. So I guess the next part of the presentation is, going to take a bit more of a detailed look at those alternative mite products and to look at some scenarios or strategies for rolling those products out in terms of the sequence and the timing of applications, which are going to be aimed at not only trying to optimise mite management, but also trying to reduce the risk of mite resistance getting even worse. So I'll hand over to Paul now to continue.
Right, look, thanks for that, Lisa. What I want to do over the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes is just cover off a little bit on mite management, talk a little bit more about each of the products that are available to us to use this season. Want to then touch on the changes that Tim's has ratified for the IRMS for this coming season, and then want to finish with a little bit of discussion with the group around potential use patterns, particularly around diphenthioron and ivermectin for the coming season in the Gwydir and the Namoi. So just reiterating a few of the points that Lisa had in her presentation. So when we think about mite management this season, farm history is a significant factor. So if you sort of cast your mind back to just that slide Lisa had up before where she had the diphenothiron testing results. You know, there's sites there with 50 to 70% resistance. There's sites with barely any resistance and sites that, you know, might be around that sort of 2 to 10, 15% resistance. And the feedback from those sites would suggest that the history of use within those field areas or those farm areas are constituting a big making a big contribution to those numbers that have been seen. So if you're managing a rain-fed site that's quite some distance away, it might be a new field, there's been no real extensive history use of diphenothiron, for example, in that area or on that farm, it may well be safe to assume that you're looking at a very low level of resistance to diphenothiron. Contrast that with if you're in perhaps an irrigated field where there was reasonable use of diphenothiron, maybe last season for mites and the season before for aphids, I think it would be fair to assume that you've probably got reasonable levels of resistance to diphenothiron there, or certainly within your immediate area. So it's just sort of something to keep in mind thinking about these products as we go into this season. The other thing I want to touch on as well, and Sam Simons has made this point at some of the meetings that we've had, and he kindly shared this particular photo with me, is just the importance of crop placement. So again, thinking about this season coming forward, we don't want to make mite management any more difficult than it needs to be. So two, I guess, points to consider is that really want to avoid sowing into weedy fields, particularly sort of in those rain-grown situations where you might sow into a field and put some glyphosate out. Or in this case, this year, if you're growing the Flex Extend, you might put some glyphosate out to tidy up those weeds, pretty much coinciding with that sowing event. If there's elevated numbers of two-spotted mite on those weeds, they will jump straight over onto that cotton and cause a problem. That's often why we see some ivermectin use very early in the season. If we can do that weed management, you know, a week or two ahead of time from when we're sowing, at least we've got that bit of a break between cotton coming out of the ground and mites immediately jumping off those dying weeds onto that emerging cotton will certainly help with our mite management. So a few things to sort of keep in mind there, particularly also around the placement. In this example, in the image there, you'll see that sorghum block there in red, and you can see the impact of mites moving out of that sorghum as it matured into the cotton blocks that are the blue blocks on either side, and the impact that took place there. So again, just things to keep in mind so that we don't make our mite management more complicated than it needs to be. So thinking a little bit now around our products. So etoxazole Zeal is certainly, as Lisa mentioned before, is the pick of what we have on offer for use this season. It's a very excellent selective product, really fits well with IPM, gives good efficacy. It works indirectly through breaking the life cycle of this pest, so it sterilizes the adult females, it impacts the eggs, it prevents the mite nymphs from molting. So very similar to the activity that we're all kind of used to and have seen with IGRs for silverleaf whitefly management. And just like with silverleaf whitefly management, and due to this IGR mode of action, it's really best targeted against developing populations that are clearly on a trajectory of increase for a later outbreak. But we want to be targeting the usage of this product sort of around that late squaring through to mid-flowering sort of period. So just like our IGRs have that use window in cotton relative to how whitefly numbers are tracking, and we sort of avoid the use of those products later in the season, this product's very much the same, but a bit earlier. We're looking at that late squaring through to mid-flowering period of time in the crop. And the key thing to stress is it's not the greatest product to use on a very high or a flared population, no different to our IGR usage on silverleaf whitefly. And really the strength of products such as etoxazole, and this is similar to our situation with silverleaf whitefly, is that these IGR products are really, really good at restoring a balance within the field, and then they do rely to some extent on natural enemies then taking up the slack as the efficacy of these products wane post-application. With that balance being restored, often natural enemies can then enact biological control and basically keep a lid on that population going forward. But obviously that only works really well when natural enemy populations are, you know, conserved as best you can. That does depend a bit on what the season throws at you. Our next product is propagate comites. Look, really good efficacy, very low resistance, no cross resistance with other products. The chink in the armour is it is more disruptive from an IPM perspective, and it can sort of induce aphid outbreaks in some situations. It can also cause phytotoxicity. The main issue is it's just been scarcely available in the marketplace. It certainly was last year. Not sure what the availability of it is this year. I haven't found anyone that's been able to confirm that it will be available. If someone's in on this conversation and can share some information that I might not be aware of, feel free to sort of chime in. But we're assuming at this stage this product may not be readily available this season. So if it is, has a very good potential fit, but we're assuming that it's probably going to be difficult to source this season. That then leaves us with ivermectin. So as you saw from Lisa's data, its efficacy is, limited, moderate at best, and that's due to that long-term continuing resistance, generally around that sort of 20 to sort of 35%. So again, field history will come into this to some respects. It is moderately disruptive from an IPM phase out, and something to keep in mind is it is on the Better Cotton Initiative's hit list for phase out by 2028. So in terms of product and longevity, possibly not one of the products that's going to be with us for the long haul. And then we have diphenothiron. Obviously, efficacy is on the verge of being lost, although quite variable within the Namoi and Gwydir districts, depending on, recent usage history in your particular farm or within your neighbouring fields and farms. Has a useful application in IPM in that we use it for control of multiple species. And again, it was targeting aphids the year before last that sort of, set this course in motion. Obviously, last season was more targeting mites. And the use of this product we have seen in locations such as emerald can flea mealybug. Optimal performance depends on those sunny, clear conditions, and like Propagite, under certain conditions, it can cause a bit of phytotoxicity. So I want to touch now on the IRMS that's been ratified by TIMS and just highlight some of the key changes that you'll see with the scheme or the strategy that's come out for this season. The first thing you'll notice is that we've shifted to the use of crop stage as opposed to dates. So the dates were a bit of a hangover from Helicoverpa management days where we had the 4 windows. This was based around the breaking of diapause and those 4 generations of Helicoverpa armigera that would occur throughout the season. More and more, this IRMS is really about non-Helicoverpa species in the most part. Sort of 3/4 of those products are for our sucking pests. And more when we looked at these products and how they sat on the strategy, they didn't really align with the old Helicoverpa dates. So, and a lot of the alignment was really around crop stage. So we've shifted to crop stage where a product does have a specific date. For example, with indoxacarb, you'll see that that's indicated on the IRMS there, but we're basically now moving to a crop stage based IRMS. This does assume, of course, that crops within a given valley are tracking in a somewhat similar manner. So there's obviously always a little bit of variability in planting, but I guess the one comment that I would make is if 95% of the valley is planted sort of in that October window, and 5% of the crop was planted in late December on a rainfall event or some favourable change, you just need to take that into account for those crops that are planted out of whack. But generally, the idea behind this is to make something that's applicable across the industry and assuming that the majority of the industry in each region is planted at a reasonably similar time. So talking now specifically about mite control products, we've purposely shifted mite control products out of the pre-flowering period largely, basically trying to avoid or omit that very early season use. Etoxazole commences around late squaring, and diphenothiron and etoxazole are limited to 1 application per season within this IRMS. There's also a reduced window for scope, and that's due to the presence of emamectin within that product mix that's in there with acetamiprid, so it kind of then got fitted to the mite situation. And the notes associated with mite management that would be on the second page of this, which I'm not going to go into today, have been revised to capture, I guess, all the changes that have happened over the last season. So if we then think about our crop stages in relation to the IRMS, we've sort of got that emergence to mid-squaring period, and the IRMS has no recommended products for that particular phase. And the intention of this, and this was discussed within the TIMS committee, is to allow time for natural enemies to establish at a time when the crop is generally at its least susceptible to damage, assuming that you haven't sown into a weedy field where there might be large populations of mites spilling across onto cotyledon and cotton. So hence, the underlying messaging around farm hygiene and planting into clean fields is going to really help you out in this particular situation. Many of the predators, and we're not just talking about thrips that feed on mites, are establishing in these crops during this period. So mites establish and their natural enemies establish. For example, people often ask, how effective are thrips? Give you an idea, tomato thrips are particularly effective. They consume 2 to 6 mitex per day. Seedling thrips only do 1 to 2, so they're a little bit less effective, but on average, 2 to 3 thrips floating around on a plant will certainly consume all of the eggs being laid by a female mite. And this really can set us up to have a much lower trajectory of mite increase if we can get these beneficials, not just thrips, but some of the other things that are in there established during that squaring period. Hence, we're avoiding control up until mid-squaring. Then from late squaring to mid-flowering, the IRMS is recommending etoxazole, accepting that we're going to put a bit of pressure on this particular product. But thinking about its use, just like our other IGRs for silverleaf whitefly management, it really is best targeted around this crop stage and targeted against those populations that are low but showing a increased trajectory that is indicating that there's going to be a future issue with mites. So ideally, what does that look like? We're talking low, so around 20 to 30% of leaves or plants infested, and the population is increasing at around 1% today. So what does that look like in practical terms? You know, between, say, sampling today and sampling this time next week, if you're seeing a 10% increase, that's certainly around that 1 and a bit% increase per day. It's really unsuitable for controlling moderate to heavy infestations that are increasing at 2 to 3% per day. So it's not that it won't work, it's just going to struggle to pull those numbers back. So it's sort of just not that optimal situation for getting the best out of this product. Like our IGRs for silverleaf whitefly, it's really not that great for use after cutout. So that's why we've targeted in this particular window within the IRMS. Its translaminar requires good coverage for effectiveness, just like our silverleaf whitefly products. Once applied, it remains active. It's in the leaf tissue for up to 2 weeks. Again, very similar to pyriproxylin, for example, and strictly limited this season to 1 use per season. So we want to use this product once, use it well at the right time, at the right crop stage. From canopy closure onwards is probably where we get into that difficult period, and our choices with the RMS will be propagate, abamectin, and difenthiron. And propagate would probably be the most effective follow-up product after etoxazole if we found ourselves with a mite population that begins to start rising again. However, the supply of that product's at this stage very uncertain. So I guess the rest of this conversation will focus on the remaining 2 products, being abamectin and difenthiron. Now, it's debatable as to which order you might use these products. There's all different ways of weighing this up, and I'm going to step through that over the next couple of slides. But I would sort of suggest that given the potential for greater future utility of difenthiron, maybe preferencing abamectin first might make sense, in that that might lead to a reduction in selection pressure on difenthiron, in that we might not have to come back a 3rd time. So by default, we've preserved difenthiron. Ideally, though, we want to use these products in the same order across each of our valleys, and that would be advantageous from a resistance management perspective, which we'll get to that discussion at the end. So how to best use them? And as I said, it is open to debate, and there are pros and cons. So some of the considerations are, ideally, these products would be considered if populations are showing signs of resurgence around that 4-week mark after etoxazole has been applied. So etoxazole takes time to work. It's active in the plant for 14 days, and natural enemies often take over when that efficacy begins to wane. So we want to sort of don't just be jumping in there 2 weeks after we've done that application, unless, you know, numbers are really getting away on us. But we sort of want to allow time for this to work, time for, I guess, IPM to do its thing. But, you know, that's sort of how we want to fit this in. It's going to be made more difficult if we need to use disruptive chemistry for shield bug management. I know this is a problem, particularly in the Gwydir in some years. You get shield bugs move in after Christmas time, require the application of something like one of the neonicotinoids, and it can sort of stymie this objective. So obviously we want to avoid using other disruptive chemistry for other sucking pests. Mirids, we've got a few more options. Shield bugs, yes, I admit they're difficult. There's not too many solutions around that, apart from, I guess, not controlling these particular pests until they do actually need control. And there's no debate about the need to control them, but we just do want to wait till we get to threshold. Abamectin and difenthiron, we're hoping within this scenario will be still effective enough that after we've come out of an etoxazole and population might be rising that little bit, that we can dampen them back down and get good control. But they're possibly going to struggle if we've got a population that is really increasing and getting away on us. So the challenge in our management will be that balance between being patient, allowing sufficient time after our etoxazole application and waiting for that balance and that population to emerge, but also being prepared to make the call and put on a second application of one of these other two products should we start to see that mite population genuinely resurge, in that we're seeing that 1% increase per day, or you go into the field this week, next week it's gone up by 10 to 15%. That's definitely fitting this criteria. So other considerations, I guess diphenthioron has greater utility than ivermectin, so possibly putting more of our efforts into conserving this particular product, given that it has a role to play for whitefly and aphid management as well. Ivermectin is more likely to be withdrawn from use sooner than diphenthioron. That's due to those Better Cotton Initiative restrictions that are coming later this decade, and also the usual ABPMA review processes that tend to sort of one thing follows the other that many of you will have noticed. It also might make sense to reserve diphenthioron usage until last. So we roll in maybe with an ivermectin. If we did unfortunately have to come in for a third application, maybe we save that diphenthioron till last when we're around that 10% open bowl. Might have additional utility if we do have silverleaf whitefly that would benefit from a bit of suppression or the odd aphid getting about. But at the end of the day, this is sort of where we're going to hand this over to a bit of discussion with all of you that are online, particularly those of you that are managing crops this season in each of these valleys, is however you wish to use these products, we need to have some consensus within each of our valleys in the order of how we might use these two products within that window, so that at least we're all on the same page and we're all kind of pulling in the same direction. Obviously, accepting the fact that we're sort of don't have a lot of options available to us at this point. So I'll just leave this slide up, sort of tried to capture just some pros and cons. Some of the pros are kind of like a bit of a flip. In the ivermectin, for example, resistance is somewhat stable. You could argue it probably couldn't get too much worse at this point in time. Whereas diphenthioron, I think there's a window of opportunity to kind of pull it back and maybe preserve it for that little bit longer. So one of the Tim's, I guess, actions from our meeting, which was just prior to the conference, was that we would undertake a bit of consultation around this and I guess basically provide people with some ownership as to how they want to proceed with the strategy. So yeah, look, I'd really like to welcome what people's thoughts are in terms of the use of particularly ivermectin and diphenthioron.
Thank you very much to Paul and Lisa as the guest speakers. And just know that, the CottonInfo REO is always available for you all. So if you want to try and get in touch with Paul or Lisa, let us know. We can help make sure that that happens. And thanks everyone for joining us.
All right. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks, guys.